happy to introduce our first speaker, Walter Heyer. Walter Heyer was a husband, father, and corporate executive who underwent gender reassignment at the age of 42. 8 years later, he reversed that decision and has been restored to his male gender. Through his mission and worldwide speaking ministry, Walter is seeking to raise awareness about gender reassignment and its consequences. Please join me in welcoming Walter Heyer. Thank you, Walter.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Deborah, and everybody that made it possible for me to come and share with you what happens when we don't celebrate our gender properly and how it can turn our lives upside down. And what I bring today to this discussion, and the other speakers as well, is 73 years of experience, because this journey for me, am I on now? Okay. 73 years of experience, life experience, because my journey started when I was 4 years old. And it started in 1944, when we didn't even have the terminology then. Nobody knew what a transgender was. This is a time when in the States there was a war going on across the ocean. There were no TV sets, there were no cell phones, and there was no way to communicate between one another about somebody struggling with gender identity. And so this started in just outside of LA in a little town called Highland Park. My mother and father gave birth to me in 1940, and by the time I was 4 years old, they had been taking me to my grandmother's house, who she babysat me. And she was a seamstress, and she made clothes for people that she knew, and that was the way she earned her money. And she'd been a seamstress for many years, and she was quite good at it. And she would make wedding dresses and all kinds of things in her little house in Highland Park. And so as I was there babysitting, I do remember that I got very curious about the clothing that she was making all the time, and I began to be very curious at the age of 4 about being a female. And I'm sure that when I approached her about this, she became curious as well. But for the transgender seed or dysphoria or whatever term that you want to use, for it to metastasize and begin to grow, what you need is somebody like a little boy at 4, like I was, who had an interest and a desire, apparently at that time, to be a little girl, or at least dress like a little girl. And then you needed someone who was going to affirm you and enable you to do that. And so Grandma began to allow me to cross-dress. And because she was a seamstress, she had this little cushion, and because I was small, she had me stand on that cushion, and she made me this most beautiful purple chiffon evening dress when I was very young. And what I realized was that I began to really like and enjoy what I saw coming back from her. In other words, that affirmation, that joy that she was getting was filling me up with joy as well. And I was really enjoying dressing as a little girl. And so this became, as Grandma said, this is our little secret. Don't tell your parents. So this was a little secret in the house that we had, and it went on for 2.5 years. Every time that I would go over there, I would put on that purple dress, and I would play the little girl. And I began, like I said, to really enjoy the feedback, the affirmation, and what I really felt like was love that I was getting from my grandma. At 2.5 years, I became so accustomed and so desired so much to wear that dress that I decided to, I knew it was a secret, but I decided to take the dress home and hide it at home so that I could dress even more often instead of just when she was babysitting. So I put it in a brown bag, and when my dad came to pick me up at the end of the weekend and went home, I put that purple dress in my bottom dresser drawer, thinking I could hide it and I could wear it when no one would know. How foolish I was. I was about 6.5 years old by this time. Well, my mom was putting some socks or something in my dresser drawer and found the dress. And so after dinner was over and my older brother had left the table in our little house in Eagle Rock, she began to ask me about that purple dress. Where'd that come from? Why do you have that in your dresser? And I said, well, kind of shamefully in many ways, Grandma made it for me, and I've been wearing it, and I really like wearing it. Well, my dad, who is an industrial goods salesman and a part-time police officer, and a big guy, came unhinged like a cheap watch. And Mom was very frustrated with her mother because, keep in mind, think of how you would feel if someone like your mother had kept this secret for 2.5 years and you'd been cross-dressing the little boy, the little boy, when I was home, liked wearing cowboy boots, and I always had torn jeans, and I always laugh about our house at the time. We didn't have grass. Our front yard was dirt, you know. People during the war in those times didn't have much. So it was very confusing to my dad, and it was very confusing to my mother. So the purple dress was thrown away, but it stayed up here. It lived in me because I became attached to it, and it became my desire to be a girl. But I didn't know whether it was possible or not. Again, we're living in a time where you couldn't get on the internet. I didn't have chat rooms. I was living this dream about being a girl within myself. But my dad, struggling with this whole new thing because he knew nothing about it, he decided that the way he was going to man me up was to take a hardwood floor plank. And when I needed discipline, he would drop my trousers on my bare butt and hit me with a hardwood floor plank many times. Because I think in his own way, he was very frustrated as well, not knowing what to do. And I can really understand that. But the hardwood floor plank was not going to drive the purple dress out of my desire. And to try to prove to him that that plank was working, that it was making me a man, and I made a lot of mistakes, so I got quite a few spankings. I decided that I was not going to cry anymore when he spanked me. I was just going to resist that. And so no matter how much it hurt, I didn't cry. And I internalized it. But I was internalizing many things at that time, as you could imagine. This desire to be a girl, to wear the purple dress that was no longer around. And so this whole process started. And as I began to lay in bed at night, I would think about it. How could I become this girl? And my older brother, we lived in the same room, and I always hated the fact that as soon as his head hit the pillow, he was asleep. I would lay there for hours thinking about the purple dress and about how could I become a girl. By the time I was in my teens, the thoughts had never gone away. The desire had never gone away. But I still didn't know if it was possible. But I took on a name that I kept secret, just like the purple dress. And I identified, I think I was about 12 years old, as Crystal West. I have no idea why I picked that name. But that was the name that I picked so that I could have this identity female inside me. So I was living this duality where I was the boy during the day and a girl in my head at the same time. So going to school, I wasn't a very good student. I struggled, and I suspect a lot of that was because this radio played in my head, so to speak, about wanting to change genders, about how was it going to work, how could I do it, who could I tell, because that had to be a secret as well. I didn't know anybody in the 40s that had ever gone through a change. So I was dealing with this totally on my own. But I ran track. I played football. I was a kicker on the football team. I was in theater arts. I was very successful in theater arts in school, and even had an opportunity to play at the Pasadena Playhouse in Pasadena, one of the famous stages in Pasadena. And so I even was offered a screen test, which I never took. But in any case, everything I touched, I was quite successful with. But I still had the girl and the purple dress stayed in my head, and the desire never went away, although for many years I couldn't act upon it. But in 1952, the headlines came out. Christine Jorgensen, very famous, first-time headlines about somebody who was, I believe, in the military, had changed genders and became a female. At that moment, from that headline, I knew then what I had been thinking since I was 4 was possible. That gave me a whole new idea about living out this dream, but there was also a struggle. Was it right? How would it work? Would it be successful? I wasn't homosexual. I had no same-sex desires. That was not part of the landscape for me. I had an identity issue, a gender identity issue that didn't deal with sexuality. I had a girlfriend in school, Lola Joy Phipps. Now, what a great name. Lola Joy Phipps, you know. And she was really one of the more attractive gals in school, so I was, feeling cool. And we'd sit and have lunch together, and I'd let the other guys kind of drool. And so Lola and I became real good friends, and we dated. By this time, I had a car in the Los Angeles area in 1955. I had a 1934 Ford with a Corvette motor, chop-top red car. I was hot. I was one of the coolest guys in school, but I was also the coolest guy in school who had a purple chiffon dress and a desire to be a female. What a contrast. I sat down one day and I remember Elvis music in the background, and I'm at Joy's house, and I decided to tell her about my dilemma. I'd never told anybody before. And I took up the courage and began to share with her what this was about, and she just hugged me. She says, "Oh my gosh, I've never heard of anything like this." But she said, because of this, we can't date anymore. I said, yeah, I understand that. She was broken by the fact that I was struggling. And she could see at that moment because I was weeping. This kid with the beautiful Ford was hurting. So everything always looked good on the outside. But that darn purple chiffon dress played a big role in how I saw myself. And it was breaking me. eventually, I met a gal in church, and we ended up getting married. And I became, I went to school actually in Pasadena City College, and studied engineering for a brief time, and got a job as a draftsman for a place called Libroscope. And then I eventually went to work for North American Aviation, where over a period of time, because I was fairly bright, I became an associate design engineer on the Apollo space missions, working on cryogenic connectors. So I had a great career. I was making good money. I was married. I had 2 children. I also had a purple dress in my head. A dilemma. I was making good money, and I eventually left the aerospace industry and went into the automobile business. And at that point, I had worked my way up and became the national port operations manager for American Honda Motor Company after working for a couple of other companies, and was in charge of every single automobile that came into the United States, how it was stored, transported, shipped from the time it hit the dock until it reached the dealer. Over $30 million worth of contracts and over 200 people that I was responsible for under my guidance to get these cars to the dealers. I had 2 parking places. I had a great salary. But by this time, being married for some time, and the success and the purple dress were all beginning to collide, and I began to cope with the difficulty by using alcohol. I was affluent. I was away from home. Drinking became my source of comfort to try to quell the storm about the purple dress. At the time I was working for Honda, I decided that it was time, and I told my wife, I need to see one of these gender therapists, the people who now by this time, this is like 1981, there was more discussion, there were more news stories, there was more people talking about transgenders, and now there were people who actually were known to be dealing with people who struggled with their identity, and I was struggling with my identity, believe me. So I went to the number one guy that was known in the world at that time. His name was Dr. Paul Walker. He had an office on Union Street in San Francisco, and he was actually the original author of the Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care that eventually morphed into what we have now called WPATH. But it was Dr. Paul Walker and some other people that actually set this in motion. Walker had written those standards, original standards for the treatment and diagnosing people with gender dysphoria. It was called gender identity disorder at that time. And I knew that I could get the straight scoop from somebody who was so good at knowing this. And he'd worked with Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins and had quite a history of working with people. So I was confident that if I went to him, I could trust what he was telling me would be true. I went to him, and I actually had to go to the bar next door before I went to see him because I was so nervous. And what we called in those days, I had a couple of pops, a little courage. And so I went in and met with him, and we talked. And it was supposed to be an hour session. As I remember, it went on longer than that. We kind of seemed like we built a good rapport and relationship. And before we were over, before we were done, he had said, you are suffering from a gender identity disorder. And he said, what you really need to do is undergo hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery. And I took a deep breath and thought, I've got a wife and kids at home. I've got a career where I was making a boatload of money. A career I was quite happy with, one that I frankly enjoyed very much. I didn't enjoy struggling with my gender, however. So I said, well, how does this work? He said, well, you need at least a 2-year time period, and you need to think this through, and we can work together on this, and then we'll write a letter, and we'll have Dr. Biber in Trinidad, Colorado, can do the surgery. I said, okay. Deep thinking, I can tell you. I was a bright guy. I was an associate design engineer. I was an executive. I was going to the number one guy in the world. How could anything possibly go wrong? I waited the 2 years. I communicated with him. I went back at the end of 2 years and said, okay, I'm still struggling. It never went away. I've divorced my wife by this time, after 17 years. And I said, okay, it's time. So in late 1982, he wrote my approval letter for gender reassignment surgery. I'd been on hormones for the 2 years. I'd been going through the proper therapeutic process that they recommended. And I was still working, but I was really afraid to tell Honda what I was doing. And so I took a vacation in April of 1983, went to Colorado, and underwent gender reassignment surgery, and came out of the hospital, Laura Jensen. And I felt like this great weight had been lifted from me. There was a definite euphoric excitement about having left all of the things that had happened since I was 4 years old behind me, but I'm 42 now. And I thought, this was really the answer. I couldn't quite understand how I was going to deal with Honda. I decided that before I disclosed this and went to work as Laura, even though I had this new paperwork, I hadn't changed any of the main documents, that I would get an attorney and approach Honda with legal counsel behind me. And I did that. And once I let Honda know what I'd done, with the backing of my attorney suggesting that you need to go through with this because your paperwork has been changed, I contacted them, and they ushered me to the front gate and handed me a brown box with everything out of my desk in it and said, goodbye. That was the end of my career. It was on my birthday in October of 1983. I was never able to claw my way back, no matter how brilliant or how smart I'd been in the past. I was divorced. I eventually became broke and was homeless not long after that, living in a park in Long Beach, California. Drinking heavily. Even though the euphoria about having left all the purple dress stuff, I had finally fulfilled that, I was struggling. I was divorced, no job, and I was broke. But now I was Laura Jensen. I don't know if that's a very good trade-off or not. The struggling at that time that I was having before all the change started to seem not so bad. But I was determined, like I always am. I'm a very determined person to seek out success. And I did, and I clawed my way back and went to see a psychologist at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, Dr. Dennis Guernsey, and we started working together on sort of accepting what was going on. And I went and lived with a pastor in Pleasanton, California, at his home with his 2 children. And I was Laura, and they were accepting me, and I was accepting myself, and I began to go to work. As Laura, I got a job with a federal deposit insurance company, banking, and I actually became an executive on Mahogany Row for FDIC as a transgender female. I began to think I needed to go to school. I wanted to study psychology. I actually wanted to get my PhD. Because at the time I thought, I want to help other people achieve this transgender life that I had achieved. And I knew that I could help others. I had a better insight because I'd been through this now. I went to UC Santa Cruz and began to study psychology, and one of the things that I found when I started opening some textbooks, the very first thing that jumped out at me was this thing about separation anxiety and transgenders. And I thought, oh, I'd never heard that before. And it told a story, a case study about an individual who had lost his mother due to death or suicide. I forget exactly how her death came about. But he was very close to his mother, and she was gone. And in this textbook case, said that the boy took on his mother's identity as a female so that he could feel close to her, as if she had not gone. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And as I began to read more and more about the whole transgender thing, I began to see there were studies from Cornell and other universities where they'd been looking at transgenders and their psychopathology and so forth. And then I began to wonder about my own. What was triggering this? Was it real? I mean, I'd gone through it. I had a birth record that said I was a female. I was living the life. I was successful. I lived in a nice place in San Francisco. But the books in school were starting to get my attention. And so, as working toward my counseling degree, I was doing an internship in a hospital in Santa Monica in a dual diagnosed psych unit. And I was Laura at the time, working in this lockdown psych unit. And we had a doctor there, psychiatric doctor, that I became very close with because we worked with the patients on the unit. I was what they called a chemical dependency tech, and it was part of my school training. And he looked at me and he said, I've worked with you now for several weeks, and I wonder if anybody's ever suggested to you that you might have a dissociative identity disorder. I said, no. He gave me a list of names of people to go see. He said, I don't want to tell you which one to go to, but he said, just go and get diagnosed as Laura. So I went and went to a gal on Wilshire Boulevard in Hollywood and spent 3 months going in and just seeing her at $125 a pop. And I thought, how long is she going to drag this on, because my bank account is really shrinking. And so she came back and said, okay, we can sit down and talk about this. She said, I've come to the conclusion that you have a dissociative identity disorder, but it's not to the level of multiple personality. She said there are different levels to dissociation. And in your case, it's just you dissociated from the young boy at a young age. And one of the components that I didn't share early on, I can tell you that came up in my discussions with her, was that when my uncle found out when I was about 7 years old, 8 years old, that I'd been cross-dressing, it was my dad's adopted stepbrother, he said that, he sexually molested me for about 2 years because he thought I was fair game because I'd been wearing the purple chiffon dress. So that component came in there, and with cross-dressing, the hardwood floor plank, and being sexually molested, I began to actually, according to the doctor, not want to be who I was, and began to want to become someone who was not going through all the things that I went through. And so I took on that identity. But living with the pastor, I'll conclude this pretty quick. I'm getting the 5-minute mark. Okay. I can go on too long sometimes. But I lived with the pastor and began to realize that I needed the power and grace of Jesus Christ. And I started going to church, and I started recovering from alcoholism, and I started working toward my 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd had gained some sobriety. And I went to this PhD therapist to go through my 4th step with him. And as we sat there, I had all these yellow line pieces of paper. I'd written down everything that I'd gone through in my life, and we discussed these things for 2.5 hours one Saturday afternoon at his office in Pleasanton, California. And when we were done going through these things and praying about each one of them, one at a time, he said, let's go outside, take your yellow line paper. And we went outside in the parking lot. And he held up the yellow line paper and he lit a match. And he put a match to the corner of those papers and let them burn. And the gentle wind picked up those papers and they drifted away. And again, there was sort of a weight that lifted from my shoulders. And so he said, let's go back in and pray about what we've done today. And I said, okay. And I got to admit, at that time, I was not one of these people who liked to pray much. And he was a guy who liked to pray for hours. And I thought I was in deep trouble. And I'm not sure if I really wanted to go back and pray with him or not. But I said, okay. So we went back in and he began to pray, and I don't know how long the prayer went on, but things got real quiet. And I almost like I could hear him, and then his voice, I know he was talking, but I couldn't hear him. And all of a sudden, I looked up, and looking back at me was the Lord Jesus Christ. I could see his face, and he was coming toward me with his arms stretched out to me. And at the time, I could see that I was a little baby wrapped up in cloth. And he reached down and picked up that baby in his arms. And the Lord, looking right at me, said, you will be safe with me forever. And he disappeared. And I knew at that very moment, during that prayer that I wasn't so sure that I wanted to do, the Lord had come to redeem and restore my life so that I could come and share my testimony with you and with others around the world that the power and grace of Jesus Christ can redeem the most broken, the most troubled, the most distorted thinking, and serve Him in a way that can help others find their way to restoration and redemption just as I have. So thank you for allowing me to share this time with you.